Hello, my name is Roger Henderson. I'm a GP in southwest Scotland, and I also co-host the GP Notebook study groups. Welcome to this GP Notebook podcast, where we discuss bite-sized topics aimed at all those working in primary care. Now, you can find us on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. So do please follow us to receive notifications about new episodes, and if you like what you hear, do please consider leaving a review to help other listeners find us. You can also follow us on Twitter at GPnotebook for more information about new podcast episodes and study groups which occur year-round. Finally, you can visit gpnotebook.com for podcast episode show notes and to find out more about upcoming study group meetings. Now, in this episode, I'm going to be discussing the new NICE NG248 guidelines on gambling-related harms, identification, assessment and management, which were published this January and which will undoubtedly affect how we assess and treat our patients who are experiencing problems linked to gambling. So let's remind ourselves first about some of these problems. We know that gambling is associated with a range of harms for people who gamble and for those people close to them, and these include mental health problems and a risk of suicide, the breakdown of families or relationships, obviously financial problems, and health inequalities. Now, we know that around 0.5% of the adult English population experience problem gambling. Just under 4% are at elevated risk of gambling harms, and an estimated 7% of the British population are negatively affected by someone else's gambling. Now, to date, there were previously no national guidelines on diagnosing or treating gambling that harms in the UK. Treatment pathways are unclear and unknown by many, with limited poor quality data to accurately assess outcomes. Current gaps in care include poor provision of treatments aimed at specific groups of people and a lack of follow-up and ongoing care. And most treatments are offered on a short-term basis, and relapse is unfortunately common. There's also a lack of identification and support for affected other people, such as family members and friends. Now, in the government's response to a coroner's inquest on gambling harms in 2022, the Department of Health and Social Care committed to undertake an initial review of the existing adult gambling treatment system in England, led by the DHSC's Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. Gambling treatment is provided in clinical settings by the NHS, and in community and residential settings by charities and community organisations, the so-called third sector. The National Gambling Helpline is the most common route into treatment and mostly sends referrals to these third sector providers, with self-referral being the second most reported route. Now, in its first ever recommendations on gambling, NICE have just published their guideline NG248 that says that GPs should look for gambling-related harms, including to health, finances, and people around the patient, such as their family and local community. Now, these guidelines cover recommendations on identifying, assessing, and treating people over 18 years old who are experiencing gambling-related harms. But the recommendations are also for people of any age affected by someone close to them who's experiencing gambling that harms. Now, there are 7 basic areas of recommendations in the guidelines: case identification, initial support, referral and assessment. Second, information and support. Third, models of care and service delivery. Fourth, improving access to treatment. Fifth, the treatment of gambling-related harms. Sixth, relapse and ongoing support. And seventh, interventions and support for families and affected others. Now, there's insufficient scope in this podcast to cover all the recommendations here, but I thought I'd highlight some of the areas that stood out to me. And the first is perhaps the most basic: asking your patient about gambling. The guidelines say we should consider asking people about gambling even if they have no obvious risk factors for gambling-related harm when we ask them about things like smoking, alcohol consumption, or use of other substances. We should also ask them about gambling in certain situations when they may be at risk of gambling-related harm. So, for example, when they present in any setting with a mental health problem or concern, when they're taking medicines that might affect impulse control, for example, dopamine agonists for Parkinson's disease or aripiprazole for psychosis. If they're in contact with the criminal justice system, we should ask them if they're present in any setting with problems relating to alcohol or substance dependence, especially the use of cocaine. We should ask if they are at risk or experiencing homelessness. We should ask them about gambling when they share that they have financial concerns, or when there are concerns about safeguarding issues or violence, including domestic abuse. And we should also ask when they share that there is a family history of gambling that harms, or if there is alcohol or substance dependence. The guidelines also say we should be considering asking people about gambling if they're at increased risk of harm because they have a neurological condition or an acquired brain injury that leads to disinhibition or increased impulsivity, or if they're a young person who's recently left home for the first time, or because of their current or past occupation. And examples here would include armed forces personnel, veterans, and people working in the gambling or financial industries. Now, when we're thinking about the treatment of gambling, the guidelines divide this into psychological and pharmaceutical options. So let's look at the psychological ones first. And these state that we should be considering motivational interviewing to strengthen people's confidence and commitment to change, or to encourage people who are unsure or who have reservations about starting treatment for gambling. We should be offering group CBT to reduce gambling severity and frequency, and this should be started as soon as possible after the diagnosis has been made. If that individual doesn't wish to join a group, then individual CBT should be offered. So ideally, CBT should be delivered as a group intervention by 2 practitioners, at least one of whom has gambling-specific CBT training, and be delivered in line with evidence-based treatment protocols. This CBT should be provided as a course, usually with 8 to 10 sessions for group therapy or 6 to 8 sessions for individual therapy. And these should include a relapse prevention component that covers, for example, how to deal with triggers for gambling or how to respond to a relapse. Now, when we're looking at pharmacological treatment for gambling that harms, we can now consider naltrexone to reduce gambling severity if psychological therapy hasn't achieved the desired outcomes after an appropriate course has been completed, or the person has repeated relapses despite having received an appropriate course of psychological therapy. Now, as of January 2025, this remains an off-label use of naltrexone, and it should be started by or under the supervision of an appropriately qualified and experienced specialist. And we should also consider using it along with continuing psychological therapy. Now, as a reminder, when we're starting naltrexone, always check that kidney and liver function are within the normal ranges, and that the patient is not taking opioids before starting naltrexone, and advising them to avoid taking any opioids whilst taking naltrexone. We should be considering an initial dose of 25 milligrams once a day for 3 days, and then increasing the dose to 50 milligrams once a day for 4 to 6 months. And we should agree a follow-up plan with the patient to regularly monitor for effectiveness, for safety, and for side effects by doing things like regular liver function tests, for example. We must recognise that relapse in people whose gambling has decreased after treatment can be distressing for that person and can raise the risk of self-harm or even suicide. And so we need to discuss the risk of relapse with people who experience gambling that harms. And we must point out to them that relapse is not shameful and it may be part of a normal recovery journey. And it does not indicate individual failure. Having a plan in place to recover quickly will increase confidence and reduce shame, and relapses can occur because of both individual or environmental factors. We should also consider additional treatment or support for people where the agreed outcomes have not been achieved through the original intervention, or who may be at higher risk of relapse or who have relapsed. And we can discuss this with the person, what additional treatment or support they may need. And this can include things like additional CBT, peer support or support groups, or support with ongoing harms, for example, ones that relate to employment or finance, health, or housing that may be provided by voluntary sector organisations. And that's basically a very brief overview of the new NICE guidelines on gambling-related harms, and I do hope you found it helpful. But have a look at the show notes that accompany this episode at GPnotebook.com, and we'd be very grateful if you'd consider following the podcast and leaving us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really does help. Always feel free to get in touch via social media at GPnotebook or email us support@gpnotebook.com if you have any questions, comments or ideas for future podcasts. You can also visit us at GPnotebook.com to register for our virtual GP Notebook study groups, which occur all year round, and to download free shortcuts to help improve the lives of our patients in primary care. But as always, until the next time, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.